The late Richie Havens here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich is our guest today. I want to turn to another clip from the new film Inequality for All, which will be released around the country on September 27th. Here, Bob Reich explains how he got interested in issues of economic justice.
When I was a kid, the bigger boys would pick on me. You know, that was what you did. That's what is done. So I got an idea that I would make alliances with older boys. You know, like just one or two who would be my protectors. The summer when I was about 10, one of the older boys who I depended on to kind of be a protector, his name was Michael Schwerner. In the summer of '64, I learned that Mickey had been in Mississippi registering voters. And he and two other people who had been with him registering voters were tortured and murdered. And when I heard that my protector had been murdered by the real bullies, I think it changed my life. I had to protect people from the bullies, but the people who would beat them up economically, or the people who would subject them and their families to real harm. Because if you don't have a voice, if you don't have power, if you are vulnerable economically in society, you don't have anybody to protect you.
That's Robert Reich, featured in Inequality for All, talking about what inspires you. This is the 50th anniversary, of course, of the 1963 March on Washington as well. Talk more about your experience.
Well, like many people who are my age, you know, the 1960s were the formative era. We were involved in the civil rights movement, even peripherally. The anti-Vietnam War movement, I spent a lot of time, you know, organizing young people for Eugene McCarthy, went clean for Gene in 1968. But out of all of that came a sense of efficacy, a sense that we really could change the world. I mean, there had been a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, we ended the Vietnam War, and there was also an assumption that I shared with many people that, of course, you would spend much of your life working to improve society. I mean, even if that was not going to be your official vocation or your job, still, that was part of your work, part of your life's work. It wasn't just me. I mean, it was really millions of us. And I think that that assumption may be different now, Amy. One of the great victories of the right, particularly the radical right, has been to spread such cynicism about the capacity of our country to change and generate social justice that many people just have given up. They basically, I don't want anything to do with politics. It's all corrupt. I don't want anything to do with that kind of focus on social movements at that scale. They'll go nowhere. But that, you see, that kind of cynicism about our politics and our government seeds everything, cedes control to the moneyed interests, and that's exactly what they want.
Can you talk about what's just happened in California? Governor Brown says he will sign this legislation around increasing the minimum wage. It'll be the highest in the country, and yet the backlash that we have seen.
Well, look, at 85% of Americans support a minimum wage increase. If you just kept the minimum wage we had in 1968, steady, adjusted for inflation, it would be $10.40 right now. If you adjusted the minimum wage for the productivity improvements we've had since the late 1960s, the minimum wage would be over $15 an hour. I mean, Martin Luther King in 1963, that was a march for jobs and justice, and one of the planks was moving the minimum wage to $2 an hour, which in today's dollars would be well over $14. In fact, by some measures, about $15 an hour. So this is not out of our tradition. This is not a radical notion. This is what it would be, all other things being equal. And if you put more money in people's pockets, they can turn around and buy stuff, which means more jobs, not fewer jobs.
Let's go back to another clip of Inequality for All. The focus here is the problems of American workers today.
Contrary to popular mythology, globalization and technology haven't really reduced the number of jobs available to Americans. These transformations have reduced their pay.
I mean, it's not just that wages are stagnating, but when you take into consideration rising costs, the rising costs of rents or homes, dramatically increasing costs of health care, the rising costs of child care, and also the rising costs of higher education, rising much faster than inflation. Take all of these into consideration, and you find that it's much worse than just stagnating wages. It's basically middle-class families, often with two wage earners, working harder and harder and harder and getting nowhere.
An excerpt of Inequality for All, which is being released in 2 weeks. Bob Reich, what about health care? What about the cost of health care? What about the cost of Obamacare, the cost of what Medicare for all would be? The cost of the system we have today?
Well, look, it's the most inefficient and costly system that any advanced country has. Yet we have the highest infant mortality, the lowest level of even in terms of lifespans, we don't do as well as many other advanced countries. We ought to have a single-payer plan. We will eventually have a single-payer plan. It's the only rational direction to go in. Everybody admits this. Even doctors and medical professionals and heads of medical institutes I sit with and talk with privately, they say, yes, we're going to have to go to single payer. They just don't say it publicly. The fact we didn't even have a public option in the Affordable Care Act is absurd. On the other hand, though, Amy, the Affordable Care Act is a beginning. Let's be clear. I mean, this is something that Bill Clinton couldn't get, Franklin D. Roosevelt couldn't get, Harry Truman couldn't get, John F. Kennedy couldn't get. I mean, it is at least a major step in the right direction. And the Republicans are apoplectic about it. They all want, they're threatening to not even to raise the debt ceiling unless we roll back or unless they get rid of and repeal the Affordable Care Act. I think most Americans, once they see the act working and once they enjoy the benefits, will be incredibly supportive, which is exactly what the opponents are worried about.
Why do you think the media has not been, I mean, the media is supposed to be separate from the government, from the insurance industry, has not been able to convey what these costs are and to actually show where the U.S. stands in the world so people could make a rational decision?
Well, you say the media is supposed to be separate from the private sector and separate from the insurance industries and everything else. I wish I could say with a straight face that America's news media and news outlets were not influenced at all by advertisers or by insurance companies and drug companies advertising like mad. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that Americans have not really had and been given a clear idea of the absurdities and unnecessary costs of our healthcare system. I mean, prevention is and should be the rule of the game, but it's all a matter of fee-for-service, and everybody who is inside living off of that fee-for-service likes it that way, but we've got to move to a system that awards healthy outcomes.
I want to turn to another anniversary. Next Tuesday marks the 2nd anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And playing a clip now of Robert Reich addressing an Occupy demonstration in California at the University of Berkeley in 2011.
Because of Occupy LA and the Occupy movement around America, this country is beginning to discuss an issue and a set of issues it has avoided discussing for years. And that is the increasing concentration of income and wealth and political power at the very top of this country, and what that has done to the economy and what that has done to our democracy.
That was Bob Reich speaking in California 2 years ago. What about the significance of the Occupy movement, the coining of the term 99%, and where are we today?
Well, on the positive side, the Occupy movement has had a huge effect of putting this issue front and center. Page one, a lot of discussion, reframing the debate so that people understand that it's not the middle class against the poor. It's basically a small group of Americans at the very top. I mean, the 400 richest Americans, 400 of them have more wealth than the bottom 150 million of us put together. The heirs of Walmart. Just the Walmart heirs who own, a huge chunk of Walmart stock, they have more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans put together. I mean, this is mind-boggling, and the Occupy movement showed America what was happening. Unfortunately, on the negative side, Occupy did not organize itself and discipline itself and develop politically strategic ways of effectuating many of the objections it had. And so that once the mayors and the universities began clearing out these encampments, there wasn't the kind of organization that's needed for a sustained, long-term social movement. And one thing we've learned over the years, Amy, whether it's the labor movement or the women's movement or it's the civil rights movement or any other movement, it takes a long time, it takes a great deal of discipline, it takes strategy, it takes politics, and it takes patience.
I wanted to read a critique of your theories put forward by Paul Roderick Gregory of the Hoover Institution, who recently wrote an article for Forbes called Robert Reich's F- in Economics, False Facts, False Theories. In it, Gregory writes, quote, Reich, a former labor secretary, displays a glaring ignorance of how markets work, even labor markets. In his world, big corporations convene behind closed doors to decide how much they deign to give to their workers after they've taken their often obscene profits. He does not understand that wages are generally set in markets, not in smoke-filled corporate boardrooms. He displays an even greater lack of appreciation of profits as signals to guide resource allocation as sources of investment finance. To Reich, profits seem always to be too high, wages too low. I would like to ask him how many workers would be employed if businesses earn no profit and labor got everything. Well, respond, Robert Reich.
Well, that's a typical right-wing argument. You know, the Hoover Institute, where this fellow is, and Forbes magazine that calls itself a capitalist tool. I mean, they're putting out this stuff, and they put it out for years. This is not new. The fact of the matter is that one of the major ways in which American corporations have shown huge profits over the last few years is by keeping payrolls down, by squeezing wages. This is well documented. I don't have, this is not my own personal view, Amy. This is, we know it. There's abundant evidence and abundant proof of this. And that is why, in part, the top 1% has done so well, because they are the ones who get a lot of their income out of the stock market, whereas everybody else, the only asset that most other people have, if they have any assets at all, is the value of their homes. And home values are the things that really took a huge hit after 2008. They're slowly beginning to come back, but many people are still underwater. So if you don't look at this reality, if you don't look at the asset base of the wealthy versus the asset base of most other people, you can begin to be convinced by this propaganda.
I was just watching, actually, Steve Rattner this morning, right, who is the American financier who led the presidential task force on the auto industry for the Obama administration, when talking about the California increase in the minimum wage bill, talked about how, for example, at fast food restaurants, he said maybe minimum wage, should be increased. But when you're talking living wage, when these people want $15 an hour, that's not what these fast food restaurants are about. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, it's not, we're not talking about individual mom and pop operations so much as we are talking about the Walmarts, the very large chains, retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital. Walmart is the largest employer in the United States right now. McDonald's and others, if they raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour, that would have several positive effects. It would, as I noted a moment ago, give people more money with which they could then turn around and buy stuff, which is going to keep other people employed. It would, secondly, enable these people to live without the dependence on food stamps and other safety nets that we're all paying for. We're all subsidizing Walmart and McDonald's and others. These are not any longer, their employees are not any longer teenagers. I mean, these are mostly adults. The typical Walmart worker, the typical even fast food worker at one of these big chains is earning at least half of family income. And if they are not going to pay their workers enough, the rest of us are going to have to subsidize their workers. Even the Earned Income Tax Credit is a subsidy to these companies so their workers are not impoverished. And that's just, that's not fair. That is not economical. That gives them, these companies, a competitive advantage that is simply unwarranted.
Janet Sparks, a Walmart employee, was recently speaking at a protest and comparing the wages of Walmart workers to the CEO of Walmart, which was something like $20.7 million.
Well, the gap between CEO pay and the pay of the typical workers, you don't even have to go to the low-wage workers, is now at a record 350 times. So anybody who says that somehow these companies can't afford it is not looking at their profit and loss statements, is not looking at their extraordinary corporate profits overall, the share values which have risen dramatically since the Great Recession relative to what's happened to wages. I mean, if you look at the economy as a whole, the share of the economy going to wages is at the lowest level we have seen in about 5 decades. The share going to profits is at the highest level we've seen in decades. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is not abstruse economics. These are data available to everybody that have been well reported.
So what can the Obama administration do? What can President Obama do to address this greatest gap in wealth in this country that we've ever seen? Well,
number one, introduce a bill to raise the minimum wage. He says that he is going to do that. Still hasn't done it. His minimum wage bill is very modest. I think it ought to be a minimum wage that's higher than $9 and whatever, I can't remember whether $9.20 or $9.50. But secondly, I think that the president and other members of the administration ought to be out there campaigning for better wages, because even as people start to get new jobs back, those new jobs are paying less than the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession, which means that the median wage, the wage of the, I'm not talking about average wages. You know, Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, and I have an average height of 6'1". Do you get my point? I'm pretty short. I mean, every time you say average, watch your wallet, because the people at the top are bringing up the average. But if you look at the median, which is really halfway there, that gives you a pretty good snapshot of where the middle class and certainly the poor are. That median wage keeps on dropping, adjusted for inflation, which means that more and more families are being squeezed to a greater and greater and greater extent. This economy is not working for everyone. And one of the points we make in the film, which I have been writing about, but the wonderful thing about a film is that you can dramatize something, is that the economy is not something out there. It's not kind of a state of nature. The economy is a set of rules. It's based upon basically rules that are decided upon by our democracy. And if our rules are generating outcomes that are unfair, that don't work very well, that don't spread enough of the gains of economic growth to enough people, we change the rules.
Can you talk finally about the significance of who will head the Federal Reserve, what that means in this country? Now we've got the battle between Janet Yellen and Larry Summers. You have a long history with Larry Summers. President Obama is rumored to be supporting Larry Summers. Talk about the significance of what that means, considering this 5 years, the Lehman Brothers anniversary, is all tied up with Larry Summers and his ideology.
Well, the Fed does two things. The most of our attention is on the bond buying program. That is it keeping interest rates down, and who benefits from those low interest rates? The other thing, though, that the Fed is now charged with is a great deal of regulatory oversight of Wall Street, more now than before. although Dodd-Frank is still not fully effectuated. I mean, the big banks have pushed back very hard. The so-called Volcker rule, remember that? That was supposed to be a watered-down version of Glass-Steagall, separating commercial from investment banking. Still not there. I mean, the banks have been so powerful in their lobbying and political contributions that they have not even allowed the Volcker rule to be applied. But the next Fed chair is going to have a very important responsibility with regard to oversight of Wall Street.
And what does it mean that Larry Summers is reportedly President Obama's top candidate?
Well, I'm in an awkward position here because I know Janet Yellen very well. She's a very close friend, and Larry Summers and I are friends. I've been working with him for 30 years, and so if you're asking me...
Well, aside from the friend part, you know Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, what they represent in what we're talking about, this huge income gap in this country that continues to grow.
Let me just be clear. In the late 1990s, 1999, Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, others in the administration did agree to support Republican bills to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, which, as I said, had separated investment from commercial banking. And they also opposed a move by the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation to regulate derivatives, and that's what got us into trouble, the lack of oversight of derivative trading. These are bets on bets, and this is what Wall Street was making a fortune on them by, certainly by 2007, and those bets were out of control. So let's just put it this way. Bob Rubin is also a friend, but I spent a lot of time in the administration battling Bob Rubin because Bob, although, again, I like him, and his view of the economy is through the eyes of Wall Street. And those eyes, the Wall Street's view of America, is not where most people live. It is just not, it doesn't take account of the problems, the challenges, the realities faced by most people. It views the economy as as sort of a bunch of assets to be moved around to wherever they can get the highest use and best use. And people are not simply assets.
We're going to break, and then when we come back, I want to play for you a clip of another colleague, though he was at the University of California, Berkeley years ago, the Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, and I'd like to get your response. He's calling for a global economic war crimes tribunal. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Robert Reich in a minute.